the Wade Center's podcast.
The podcast of Wheaton College.
Welcome to the Wade Center podcast. This is Dr. Crystal Downing and Dr. David Downing, the co-directors of the Marion E. Wade Center, joined by our producer, Aaron Hill. And today we want to talk about...
He's been demoted. He used to be a theologian. Now he's only a producer.
Every time I introduce him differently.
We get different titles every time, David. Come on.
Yeah.
And we're here together with this other guy, Aaron Hill.
What are we going to talk about today, Crystal?
Well, we're going to talk about an essay that I bet a lot of people, a lot of our listeners around the world have not read, and partly because the title is a bit daunting.
Yeah.
It's in Latin, Descriptione Temporum, and it is...
Sounds like a menu item. Descriptione Temporum.
Yeah, the temporum sauce.
Easy on the spice, please.
This was the lecture that C.S. Lewis delivered when he began his new tenure at Cambridge University. And David, why don't you tell us how that came about? Because for many years he taught at Oxford, was an Oxford Don, and then he switched to Cambridge.
Right. He was originally got his job as a lecturer at Oxford, 20s, but he never got promoted because he partly was a Christian and partly a popularizer. And so people resented him. And so he didn't get any promotions from the 20s. And finally in the 50s, he was a world famous author. And Cambridge said, well, let's have a special chair for C.S. Lewis at Cambridge, which they called the chair of medieval and Renaissance literature, which he loved because he thought that the demarcation between medieval and Renaissance was extremely overrated. So he took the job in 1954, and this essay is his inaugural lecture at Cambridge. We're actually talking about this because we had a request from one of our listeners who said, why don't you talk about this essay? So we're like a 60s radio show that says, can you do Good Vibrations by the Beach Boys? Can you do... So we are responding to a listener who wants us to talk about this particular inaugural address, which later became a famous essay.
Well, I'm glad that we're talking about it because
I
agree.
I've actually never read this essay in its entirety.
Yeah, me neither.
I've read so many books about Lewis and articles about Lewis that I've read giant block quotes from it, but I've never sat down and read the whole thing because in my head I thought, which is foolish because everything Lewis writes is fantastic. But in my head, I thought it was going to be a lot of, I would like to thank Dr. David C. Downing for giving me this chair. I'm like, why do I need to read his inaugural lecture? It's just going to be a lot of pomp and circumstance, with a few good things in there. But of course, he shows up to the party with something really profound. It's like his introduction to On the Incarnation by Ignatius. In and of itself, it's this like amazing piece of literature and thought. So he's not just telling us what we should be looking forward to.
He never wastes your time. He never has an address or an essay, which is just kind of a filler.
Yeah.
He actually says, well, if I'm going to do this, there was a lot of drama behind this appointment because he was neglected at Oxford, and Cambridge said, this guy's world famous. He's great. Let's bring him over to Cambridge. And then Oxford said, oh, yeah, let's create another chair for him here at Oxford. And it was kind of like too late.
Oh.
And so they kind of recognized that, he probably deserved the recognition that he didn't get.
Huh.
So,
the irony, though, is he didn't give up his house right outside of Oxford. So he would take the train and stay in Cambridge for several days and then come back for the weekends, right, to Oxford?
Right. He never gave up the kilns.
Okay. Well, I as well am glad to have read it. And the amazing thing is, that he's addressing all these Cambridge dons, all these graduate students, and still this essay is totally accessible. It actually has bits of humor in it. And it just proves that he's not trying to sound intellectual. And in the very act of not trying to sound intellectual, he delivers incredible profundity.
Yeah.
So one of the ironies that struck me as I read through this fantastic essay is, yes, he's chair of the medieval and Renaissance position, but then he goes on to say, I don't even like that title, medieval and Renaissance, because there is a problem in setting up divisions between eras. And he doesn't explicitly say, I don't like that.
Yeah.
But he starts problematizing the way scholars over the years have divided up history into different eras.
Yeah.
But the very division itself reflects the ideological assumptions of the people who are doing the dividing. Now, of course, you do need those types of divisions just to give you a little word signal so you can tell people what era you're talking about.
Yeah.
But then those become absolutized. And one of the ones that he brings up is the Dark Ages. And you still hear that used today, the Dark Ages. And it's totally ironic because it is employed by people who have this assumption that the era when Christianity was dominant after the fall of the Roman Empire is the Dark Ages.
Yeah.
Those are the ages of superstition and suppression of great intellect. And that's a totally prejudicial assumption.
Yeah. Well, can I just say, in studying Christian history and all of my theology education, one of the most fascinating things to me is going back as a graduate student, learning about the quote-unquote fall of the Roman Empire. And you read it and you go, oh, so there really wasn't a day when it just ceased to exist. You have this idea that there was this amazing Atlantis-like civilization, and then all of a sudden one day there was an invasion, and they woke up the next day and they were all sweeping streets with brooms and bring out your dead. You know, it's like it just, you know what I mean? It's like those Walking Dead shows. It's like that's what we think happened, and it just all of a sudden the next day. But then you read it and you're like, oh wait, the people that invaded them were Christians?
Yeah, I know. Right.
They just happened to be Aryans, and the empire had already split, so it was being ruled, and there were like 4 different rulers, and so you realize, as he says in the lecture, he says, unlike dates, periods are not facts; they are retrospective conceptions that we form about past events, useful to focus discussion, but very often leading historical thought astray. And then he says, and I thought this is really good: change is never complete, and change never ceases. Nothing is ever quite finished. It may always begin over again.
Right.
There's a seamless, formless continuity and mutability is our mode of life. And so he's just trying to point out that all of these divisions that we make are just totally artificial. It's like I was talking very recently at a conference about the pandemic and research that I had done on the pandemic. And I was talking about it in terms of the early pandemic and the late pandemic. And I couldn't draw a nice clean line when that happened. But I think if I say those two terms, everybody in their head can go, oh, when you're saying the early pandemic, I know what you're talking about versus the late pandemic, right? But we haven't, nobody's come up with a good line in the sand for when that is, but there definitely is a point at which you could say this is the end stage of the pandemic and this was the beginning stage of the pandemic.
It's kind of like the day the music died, right?
Well, with
people go, yeah, I remember that day. Things were going well, and all of a sudden it was like nothing. Yeah, it was what happened.
But even the pandemic is easier to classify because we remember when we had to start wearing masks everywhere we went. We remember when our businesses closed down, when we had to lock the doors of the Marion E. Wade Center.
Yeah.
And for historical eras,
we had to beat off the zombies that were trying to break in. And we said, no,
this
go
is what
away.
I'm going to tell my kids about the pandemic.
Yeah.
It's more like asking someone what day or even what year did your grandmother become old?
Yeah.
Now, we all know our grandmothers are old now, but it's a gradual transition. So we know there's youth versus old age, and even we have something called middle age, just like historians talk about the Middle Ages in civilization. So you just have to come up with identifying characteristics.
Yeah.
My grandmother is is bent over now and having trouble with arthritis, and she's losing height. I'm kind of describing myself.
Yeah, exactly. On what day did Crystal become old?
Yeah.
Well, I wrote an essay on C.S. Lewis and postmodernism, which was how often he anticipated the idea, because that's a very postmodern idea that
that's right.
History is continuous. And you say neoclassicism and then romanticism and then Victorianism, and they're kind of arbitrary. He also has a fascinating ending to the Descartes image where he says, a lot of the questions we ask nature, the answer is built into the question. And it was a very postmodern concept, which is that our paradigms, he actually talked about paradigm shifts before Thomas Kuhn did, that suddenly everybody goes, well, that's not quite right. Let's look at it differently.
Yeah.
So this essay is great. He's giving an inaugural address, and most people just kind of say, thank you for having me here, and I love to be at Cambridge.
The chicken was nice.
Exactly. The chicken was nice. But he says, no, I'm going to say something about my view of history. You can't slice it into periods.
Yeah, I was going to say, I honestly feel like this should be taught if you're leading a Christian school. I'm just going to put it as if you're leading a Christian school, this should be like the foundation for how you teach history.
Yeah, I agree.
I'm going to go out of the limb and say, this should be how we as Christians think about history. I was reading through this going like, wow, this just makes so much sense. And a lot of it is stuff that he's talked about elsewhere. It's not like it comes out of the blue, but really profound stuff. He says we have to come up with these divisions because he says we cannot hold together huge masses of particulars without putting them into some kind of structure.
Right.
And so the question then becomes, well, what is the structure and what purpose does it serve and where do we draw the lines? And I think he does a good job of going through. And I think one of the things he does really good here, and this again would be a helpful thing in terms of Christian scholarship, is he goes through and he makes sort of fact-based judgments without commenting on sort of the value of them. There's actually a footnote in here that I thought was really interesting where he's talking about what it means to be living in a Christian age. And he goes on to say, none of us can actually quantify how many people are saved or following Christ in a given period. So we can't really quantify how Christian an age is. I'm talking about it in these terms of sort of identification, how many people self-identify as Christian. But he's going through and saying, there are limits to what we can know. So let's make judgments where we can, but let's leave other things open to discussion. Because you can go in two different directions. You can have no structure. You can do the thing that historical theologians love to do, which is you make an argument and then they find a particular that overturns some assumption that you've made. You go, well, technically when they wrote that, it was in this period, or technically when they wrote that, and it's like you can always falsify the structure with one example that doesn't fit the whole. Or the other side of it is no structure at all, right? Just total chaos. And so it's you either lean towards everything has to fit into a system and everything that doesn't fit gets discarded, or the opposite is sort of chaos. And he's arguing for, there was just a level of common sense in the way he approached this.
Yeah, actually mocks that idea that you can turn things into periods. He says, he quotes an actual historian who says, the first rift in this darkness is the Copernican doctrine, as if a new hypothesis in astronomy would naturally make a man stop hitting his daughter about the head. He's kind of mocking the idea that there are these cultural shifts which are quite dramatic and quite easily demarcated.
And part of the problem, too, and Aaron, I just love your idea of this should be taught at Christian colleges, even Christian high schools. It's accessible enough to consider our overview of history, because here in the 1950s, he's saying, well, we can sense, just as we know our grandmothers are old now, that's my metaphor, but we know there was a pre-Christian era and then a Christian era. And now, he says in the 1950s, we're in a post-Christian era.
Yeah.
And you hear that word post-Christian being used of our era now. And C.S. Lewis was living through a time that is very similar to our times today. So that's why we can learn so much from him.
Yeah. Well, when he gave this talk in 1954, there was a Christian revival in America. So in some ways, England anticipated what's happening in America now, which is the loss of faith.
What he does really well in here is he uses a term that I think this should be like standard language that we use when we talk about this now. Is he talked about the unchristening of Europe?
Unchristening.
I thought that was
Right.
so. It was so insightful. Like, if you understand the Reformation and the shift away from a model where everyone that's born in the village gets christened and is officially a part of the church,
Right.
whether or not they have some sort of personal relationship with Christ or not, which it was in and of itself a new thing. But once that shift started to occur, and that the marker of whether or not you're a Christian became sort of personal affiliation, it was a decision that each person made as an individual, as opposed to your parents christened you in the church and you're a member of the church. It totally changed our relationship to Christianity, and so thinking of it in terms of an unchristening, I think, is a very insightful way of seeing, we kind of, by choosing the method through which you are associated with a Christian church, we turn society into a personal choice. Like, do you want to be a part of the church or do you not? And more people are choosing to not be a part of it.
Right.
But that was in many ways our choice to move away from this christening model.
Right.
Yeah, he says elsewhere that he's not sure that sometimes Christianity is popular, like in the 19th century, and sometimes it's unpopular. And he says, I'm not sure that the number of genuine Christians has changed that much from one decade to the next. It's more or less, how many nominal Christians are there versus people who don't bother to be nominal Christians?
Right. Yeah, good point. Good point.
So I think he kind of says there hasn't been a sea change in terms of faith. It's only been a sea change in terms of the popularity of Christian faith.
Yeah.
And this supports your article on Lewis and postmodernism, because one of the great postmodern thinkers was a historian named Michel Foucault, a historian and sociologist.
A male, by the way.
Yeah, Michel. And he wrote a book called The Archaeology of Knowledge that challenged the very way that people had been thinking about history. Because the trouble is, when we divide eras up, we bring our own assumptions, our own perspectives to those divisions. Like when I was a little girl, I thought my grandma was just so old when she was 50. And now I go, to be 50 again.
To be 50, yes.
I don't consider 50 old, but as a little girl, that is so much older than 8 years old. And so what Foucault was doing in the archaeology of knowledge was showing that different eras operate by different, what he calls discursive practices. In other words, they have a language that they assume. So this goes back to what both Aaron and David were talking about in terms of the unchristening. So when the majority of culture just thinks of itself as Christian, they just take it for granted that language reinforces it. But that doesn't mean that they are daily thinking about, how can I be a committed follower of Jesus Christ? It's just, I live in a Christian nation.
Yeah, I think it's easier to slice history into phases when you don't live there. If somebody said, what was the difference between 1961 and 1962? I go, well, they were kind of similar.
Yeah.
But when you look at it 100 years later, you say, well, this was the Kennedy era and this was the post-Kennedy era. I like what he says. The reason he liked this chair is called Medieval and Renaissance. Because he thought the whole idea that the medievals were benighted and superstitious and witch hunters, and suddenly somebody woke up and said, "Oh no, this is the renewal." It's kind of a self-congratulatory to say, the rebirth of knowledge, the rebirth of
Well,
he said,
the assumption there is that medievalism, just even the word medieval implies this is kind of a middle stage.
Yeah, it's the middle
just like
ages,
your middle ages between youth and age.
Yeah.
This is the middle stage. This was the superstitious Christian stage between the great Greek pre-Christian thinkers who just Aristotle and the great dramatists and Euripides and Plato. And then now we have a rebirth back to that stage. And we're like the Greeks and we don't buy into those superstitious middle-age Christians.
Yeah.
And the word medieval didn't even develop until the early 17th century. And the Renaissance, that word wasn't employed until 1858, the idea of rebirth.
Oh, really?
Wow.
And so,
Wow.
you could look at it, and I bet some people who were at this lecture by Lewis thought, oh, he's the chair of medieval and Renaissance, so probably he's going to be pointing out how benighted and superstitious the medieval time was. And then we have the flowering of the Renaissance. And he wanted to make the exact opposite position, that there is continuity.
He actually, in another essay, he actually says, if you have to make a demarcation, it should be between Jane Austen and Dickens and I can't remember what essay.
No, he mentions Jane
Yeah, he
Austen
mentions
here.
that in here. Yeah,
Jane Austen assumed a Christian worldview, or even Sir Walter Scott, who Lewis loved. There's a scene in which he's asking somebody to exercise forgiveness, and he gives 3 or 4 reasons, and none of them are the biblical idea that Jesus said, judge not lest you be judged. And so he's kind of shocked that even Sir Walter Scott and Dickens didn't quite get, even the famous Christmas Carol, the story, it never says, what's the true meaning of Christmas? Christ died for us, and we all owe him a great debt. We need to live our lives in that realization. In the great story, he just says, it's turkey and it's candles and it's generosity and it's being nice to people.
Yeah.
And Lewis says something happened between Jane Austen and
Dickens.
Yeah.
That was which he calls the post-Christianing of Europe.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, he says in here, so I wanted to mention he's talking about the division between antiquity and the Dark Ages and the Renaissance. And I thought this was a very insightful thing he mentions here. He says the partial loss of ancient learning and its recovery at the Renaissance were for him unique events. He's talking about Gibbon here. And he said, but we have lived to see the second death of ancient learning.
Right.
In our time, something which was once the possession of all educated men has shrunk to being the technical accomplishment of a few specialists. And he says, if we say that this is not total death, meaning that we were not totally ignorant of everything that we recovered during the Renaissance, it may be replied that there was no total death in the Dark Ages either. In other words, and he says, they kept using Latin, they kept practicing a lot of things related to law and rhetoric. And so he's essentially arguing that, we can think about history in terms of there was this corpus of material, sort of Greek material, Greek philosophers, that was very influential for a period. And then it fell away. But it's not like everybody was totally ignorant of it. There were people that were still writing about and talking about, Aristotle and all these people. And then there was a rediscovery of it by the masses, by the majority of people. And for a while, it was something that, as he says, all educated people understood. But he was living through the second death. And you can see that when you go to school and this is stuff you have to learn now in almost like a graduate level setting to learn some of these things about, these Greek philosophers and stuff. Whereas, back then it was sort of the foundation of school and Renaissance learning. Right. So it's fascinating to think about it in terms of that fading away of knowledge, but not everybody. It's not like somebody flicks a switch and everybody just becomes totally ignorant of what happened in the past.
I was talking to some colleagues recently at Wheaton, and I said, Lewis said this is the second time that fathers knew Latin better than their sons. And the idea being the fall of the Roman Empire, people didn't speak Latin anymore. And a colleague said, well, what was the first time? And they obviously didn't realize that Lewis's idea was the Roman Empire. Everybody spoke Latin, and then it fell into disuse.
Well, except in the church.
Yeah, except in the church. But I thought it was interesting that his colleague didn't even get Lewis's analogy.
Yeah. And part of these names that developed, Dark Ages, medievalism, the Enlightenment,
antiquity.
Even the Enlightenment wasn't used in English until the last part of the 19th century. And it's the Enlightenment, the late 17th and the 18th century, where they suddenly saw the light that Christianity is no longer relevant. And part of the problem is this assumption of not only the religion of science, that we see that Lewis was going through as he was writing, that science has replaced Christianity as the religion, that science is the means to truth. But also, historians don't realize how much when they are creating their histories, they are assuming a progressivist model.
Yeah.
That culture is evolving.
Yeah.
And so the whole Darwinian model was affecting, and evolution was assumed even before Darwin started applying it biologically. And so humans were evolving from superstition and darkness, which they associated with religion, to the light, the enlightenment.
So I love how Lewis actually applied that lack of a paradigm to the fact that he had been at Oxford, now he's come to Cambridge. And he said, but the old picture, done in far cruder colors, has survived among the weaker brethren. If not, let us hope at Cambridge. Yet certainly in that western darkness from which you have so lately bidden me to emerge. So he's mocking Oxford as well as that kind of crude paradigm.
Yeah. Well, I like how at the end of this, he asked the question. He's like, well, where did people get this idea that everything is just progressing from worse to better? And he puts forward a hypothesis, which when he said it, again, this goes back to my, I think this is why this should be taught in history, because I was like, oh, that's exactly the reason.
Right.
And this is one of the things that Chesterton hates. We've talked previously in the podcast about one of his books, I can't remember which one, where he's talking about how, you invent a new thing, but it only does one very specific task versus a previous thing where, it could do a bunch of different stuff. It's the difference between a fireplace and a toaster oven. You can only toast in a toaster oven, but you can do lots of things with a fire. He says,
I say that 10 times.
I know, right?
You can toast in a toaster oven. Yeah.
But anyways, his hypothesis is, I submit that what has imposed this climate of opinion of constant progress and things getting better so firmly on the human mind is a new archetypal image. It is the image of old machines being superseded by new and better ones. And so it's this, it's kids discovering flip phones, Gen Zers discovering flip phones, or making fun of those old brick cell phones in the 1980s, or a day and time where the only way you could call somebody was by,
dial,
and you actually turn the dial on the phone, and or a time before, that where there were telegraphs. And so we have this idea in our heads of the computer that I grew up with was a piece of garbage compared to the one that I'm holding in my hand.
Right.
And so it creates this paradigm in our heads where we think, well, clearly back then they were just a bunch of people wallowing in the mud, and now we've figured everything out. And so it's not just technology that's constantly getting better and better, but everything else is constantly getting better and better.
In magazine articles that say romance 2.0 or self-esteem 2.0, and they're kind of implying that everything gets better and upgraded. And so, yeah, I agree. The idea is that, mechanical change or computer change is a metaphor for everything getting better.
So there were two other sort of paradigms that he introduces in this that to me were really revolutionary. So one of them was he talks about science as a lion. So he talks about in the beginning, science was, let's see if I can find it. Okay. The sciences long remained like a lion cub whose gambols delighted its master in private. It had not yet tasted man's blood. And his argument is the reason why it hadn't tasted man's blood is because it hadn't yet made the human its business yet. Man had not yet become the business of science. It dealt chiefly with the inanimate, and it threw off few technological byproducts. And then later on, he talks about when it first tastes blood. And so I thought that was a really fascinating idea. Rather than seeing science as a liberator or as something which necessarily exalts us, viewing it as a predator, which is sort of trying to prey upon humanity. That was a very powerful metaphor. And then the other one that really stood out to me was he says, if I wish to satirize the present political order, I should borrow for it the name which Punch invented during the First German War, Governtisement. Okay, Governtisement. This is a portmanteau and means government by advertisement.
Right.
Yeah.
And he says that in ages past, rulers wanted people to sort of live peaceable lives in godliness and honesty and pass their time in rest and quietness. They wanted them to ignore politics and
Right.
sort of forget about that so they could do their business and be undisturbed by the masses. But now, he says, our rulers have become like schoolmasters and are always demanding keenness. They want us to pay attention to them, and it requires them to have a level of magnetism or personality. And I thought, man, the fact that he figured that out in the 50s.
I know. I agree. Advertisement. Because now everything, whenever there's an election, everything is about he's evil, he's bad, he's wrong or she's wrong for this era. And he anticipated that idea of advertisement. And he said in the old days, you had rulers who tried to keep people settled. Now you have leaders who try to get them activated and organized and energized. And that's amazing. He said this in the 50s because that's pretty much a description of what we live with now.
Yeah.
Although I think there is a certain mystifying of the past going on here. This was one of the areas that I had the most problem with, that he kind of thought, well, things were better with leaders in the past, leaders in the
Henry VIII,
past.
he was so great. Other than the wives that didn't survive,
I would say, though, there are plenty of times when I think to myself, I really wish that the people, our elected officials in Washington, would just make it their business to do their job and not constantly try and get attention.
Yeah,
it's like,
yes.
Stop appearing on the news and just do your job.
Yeah.
I read a thing about Elon Musk. It said that he wants to, he's not a politician, but he wants to be in the papers every single day.
Yeah,
so he tries to think of something to say that's outrageous or unusual.
Yeah.
And that's kind of depressing. You're the richest man in the world. Just enjoy your wealth. Don't feel like you constantly have to be in front of the public.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But then Queen Elizabeth would do what were called the progress, and this was done by rulers in England before. Yeah, Elizabeth I. Where she would just drive around England in her carriage with her entourage and staying in some of the nobles' estates, but going through small towns so people could see the greatness of the leader.
Right.
So that was a type of advertisement as well, that, wow, she must be important because look at how gorgeous she's dressed and all the people following her. So I think this has been going on for a long, long time. I remember reading about Martin Luther, who was just saying, oh, our times today, are just not as peaceful as in the past. Can't we return to the time of Abraham? And I was going, Abraham? He lied about being married to his wife to protect himself.
Yeah.
And I think this is common to think about, oh, if only we could go back to the past. And I think there's probably many people who say, oh, if we only could go back to the past when C.S. Lewis was alive. Well, he's saying only if we could go back to the past. And we all do that.
In Tolstoy, where the Tsar is coming, or people say the Tsar is coming, and they wait for hours and hours to watch the Tsar and his wife, just go through the street in their magnificent carriage.
Yeah.
So that kind of celebrityism, I think, has been around. Now we go, I don't care about the Tsar, but I heard that Taylor Swift was going to be driving right here.
Exactly.
So it is a human tendency. Yeah.
Well, the other thing there's another quote in here. He says, he's talking about this idea of progression and things constantly getting better. And he comments on it. He says, how has it come about that we use the highly emotive word stagnation with all its malodorousness and malarial overtones for what other ages would have called permanence? And he says, latest in advertisements means best. He's trying to critique something about this movement, this progression towards things in the future. But what I found interesting is about that idea is there is this idea that any time that we go backwards or we try and cling to the past, we're trying to go back in time. We're trying to be
Right.
retrogressive in our ethics or retrogressive in our technology. But he argues here, and when he's talking again about Europe and the unchristening of Europe, he says Europe cannot come out of Christianity by the same door she went in and find herself back where she was. That's not how it happens. He says a post-Christian man is not a pagan. You might well think that a married woman recovers her virginity by divorce. The post-Christian is cut off from the Christian past and therefore doubly from the pagan past. So his argument is there is a sense in which we're progressing forward through time, but that doesn't mean that we can't reclaim something from the past, and that in and of itself can't lead us to something better in the future. And I would argue that that's principally what he spent his life doing, was trying to recover things from the medieval and the Renaissance period to help us understand
and he liked the
our
word
time
pagan.
better.
He always uses the word pagan positively. He says it's like pre-Christian. He loved the classics, and he loved the idea that Iliad and the Odyssey were seeking Christianity, and they became Christians. In the discarded image, he says people who wouldn't like early Christians also wouldn't like the late pagans, because it was the whisper from beyond the world that there is a truth that they were seeking, that they found in Christianity. Yeah, when people say, oh, he said this was pagan or neo-pagan, but he almost always uses pagan to mean people that are searching for Christian faith, and they finally found it when Christ arrived.
Well, I mean, he says there's a difference between people who worship, but worship different gods, and people who worship God, and then people who don't worship anything. Right? Like that's the difference there. It's like, so that's how in his mind, that pagan and the Christian have more in common, because they have this concept of worship and of a higher power that a post-Christian person doesn't.
And he gives the example of the time in which he's living, where high modernism in the arts were emphasizing, and he actually lists in this essay Picasso and the Dadaists, and the emphasis on the autonomy of perception. In other words, the great artists, they do not conform to the values of culture. They rise above culture, and they produce art out of their own vision. And so, but it's an assumption based on a fundamentally anti-Christian idea that we are autonomous in the universe.
Yeah.
We have progressed beyond the need to believe in a God. And so that's what Lewis is trying to get back to.
Yeah.
And he himself is aware that you don't get back to the past just by reigniting language of the past. He actually says in the essay, why does latest in advertisements mean best?
Yeah.
Well, because he was embedded in a culture that's their ideological assumption is of progressivism.
Yeah.
So if it's latest, it's best. And so but you don't, by banning certain words, you don't change the way people think.
Yeah.
And
but new and improved is magic in advertising.
Oh, right.
You kind of go, oh, it's new, it's improved.
Well, the assumption by putting those always together is that everything that is new is improved.
Exactly.
And it's interesting to me that we're just now beginning to reach a stage at which people are beginning to go, maybe social media is bad for us.
Yeah.
Maybe it's bad for culture. Maybe it's bad for our government. Maybe this isn't the best way to use. Maybe internet is a good tool, but we're using it in a bad way. And so it's interesting that, as you move through the history, something new comes out. Everybody assumes that it's improved. And then eventually culture has to step back and go, maybe there's a good way to use this and a bad way to use this. I feel like we're on the verge of that with AI and these large language models.
Yeah, exactly.
That Tim Cook put a statement out just recently where he was like, we need to be very deliberate and careful with how we handle AI versus these other companies that are like, we're just going to start shipping stuff and throwing stuff out there. And you're like, maybe let's not break our entire society and culture just for new and improved,
right.
you know?
How about new but not actually better?
Yeah.
Nobody uses that motto.
Right.
Do that.
I like how he ends the lecture by talking about himself as a dinosaur.
Right. Yeah.
And how you could actually, the thing that would actually help you learn the most is listening to a Neanderthal.
Right.
He
right.
says, if a Neanderthal got up here and gave a lecture, he probably wouldn't actually be able to tell you the things that you wanted to know. Like, he wouldn't be able to voice and articulate for you all the questions that you have. But by listening to the Neanderthal, he would reveal things to you by the words that he used and the way
Right,
that he
right.
thought that would answer a lot of questions for you. And so he actually goes on, he basically says, like, I'm the dinosaur.
Exactly.
Listen to me.
I'm the old Western man.
The old Western man. At the very least, even if you don't agree with me, if you try and understand the way I think and the way I read these things and the way I understand these works of literature from the past, it will help you understand the past.
Right.
This
That
lecture
is
was
a
so
postmodern
popular.
insight.
It is.
That's what Michel Foucault was talking about
Right.
in The Archaeology of Knowledge.
Well,
It's
this,
the whole culture thinks in a certain way, and he and the postmodernists just denounce this whole ideology of progressivism. And so here, and postmodernists were saying medieval Christianity was far more sophisticated than many ways of thinking today. And people who invented the words Dark Ages, medievalism, the Enlightenment, Renaissance, that language was part of this modernist progressive trend that postmodernism challenged.
Yeah, I wanted to say that this lecture was so popular that people went around saying, I'm a dinosaur. Are you a dinosaur?
Aw.
Really?
Yeah, he wrote to Dorothy Sayers, and she wrote back and said, yeah, from a fellow dinosaur.
Right, that's right.
People love the metaphor of like,
I didn't realize it was more than Sayers that was.
yeah, no, a lot of people said, well, I'm a remnant from the past. I'm a dinosaur. So,
Yeah.
so it was a very influential lecture.
Yeah.
Somebody else complained that he made past authors seem more interesting than they were. So they would go to the bookstore and read Fairy Queen or something else. They go, Lewis made it sound more interesting than it is.
I think a lot of people that listen to our podcast think that way. They
Yeah,
go,
that's true.
They go,
Yeah,
I'll
probably.
go read Fantastes, and then they pick it up and they're like, what? What's that?
Exactly.
What's the
yeah.
tree? Is that which tree is that? I don't know what you're talking
But
about.
see, that's why we have a podcast.
This is true.
If everybody could just read it and get the exact same things out of
Yes.
it, why listen to us?
Yeah, you need to listen to dinosaurs from time to time.
Right.
Right.
Well, can I close with a quote
Yes.
that he closes with that
Right.
I feel like is incredibly relevant and Christians need to understand and comes to terms with, and maybe something that people need to rediscover. He says he wants to give the reassurance, and then he gives a claim. And this is the reassurance, but I think it's actually more of a chastisement that we need to revisit. He says, I do not think you need to fear that the study of a dead period, however prolonged and however sympathetic, need prove an indulgence in nostalgia or an enslavement to the past. In the individual life, as the psychologists have taught us, it is not the remembered but the forgotten past that enslaves us. I think it is the same. The same is true of society. To study the past does indeed liberate us from the present, from the idols of our own marketplace. But I think it liberates us from the past, too. I think no class of men are less enslaved to the past than historians. The unhistorical are usually, without knowing it, enslaved to a fairly recent past. And then he goes on to say, you will be no freer by coming to misinterpret old Western culture as quickly and deeply as those medievals misinterpreted classical antiquity. And he goes on to say, such misinterpretation has already begun. To arrest its growth while arrest is still possible is surely the proper task for a university. So that idea that we don't need to be afraid of studying history, and if we cease to study it, that it may actually enslave us, I think is very relevant.
Right.
What's ironic about that quote is he said, people have told us that it's not the remembered past, but the forgotten past. He's thinking of Freud. But since he wrote that, Freud's influence is plummeted.
Yeah.
So it's ironic that he's talking about how we view the past, but he himself is kind of paying respect to Freud in a way that most modern Christian writers would not do.
Yeah.
Or even non-Christian writers. They don't take Freud seriously anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I didn't mean to undermine your quote.
No. I feel free for you guys to comment on it. When I was reading it, I thought, wow, this is incredibly relevant.
Right.
Because,
right.
I think our tendency as Christians is to try and insulate ourselves from certain aspects of the culture, to sort of maintain a worldview through exclusion. If as long as we don't expose people to these certain things, then their thinking will stay within the lines. And Lewis's exhortation is, if we decide that we're not going to study the real history, even recent history, we don't actually liberate ourselves. We actually are enslaving ourselves. We're doomed to continue those behaviors and those mistakes forward into the future if we don't understand the mistakes of the recent past.
Right. Which is exactly the point Foucault made.
Well, thank you guys. This was fun.
Okay.
Yeah.
Goodbye. Thanks for listening.
Thanks to our listeners for saying, let's dig into this essay or this address.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, we...
if you have other essays or works and stuff that we haven't covered on the podcast, we'd love to hear from it. So you can email us at wade@wheaton.edu.
Right. Somebody else wants us to do A Man Who Is Thursday.
Ooh.
And so that'll be on our schedule.
I love that book. I started rereading it just last week.
There you go.
Oh, good.
Was it Thursday?
No, it was not Thursday.
Okay.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.